Welcome to the Storytelling with Data podcast, where listeners around the world learn to be better storytellers and presenters. We'll cover a wide range of topics that will help you effectively show and tell your data stories. So get ready to separate yourself from the mess of 3D exploding pie charts and deliver knockout presentations. And with that, here's Mike.
Today, I am joined by Chris Dalla Riva, who is a musician, an analyst, a writer, and, I'll say it, a social media personality. His ability to blend art, numbers, and narrative is why I am so excited about this conversation. Now, Chris works on analytics and personalization at AudioMac, which gives him a rare perspective. He has a deep emotional connection to music as a creator, but he also understands the data behind how people discover and engage with it. Now, you might know Chris from his newsletter, Can't Get Much Higher. You might know him from the musical insights that he shares regularly with his social media audience. Or you might know him from his new book, which was several years and I believe one betrothal in the making, which is entitled Uncharted Territory. What numbers tell us about the biggest hit songs and ourselves? Chris, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. That was quite the introduction. So, I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited to chat about all this stuff. I think that's the first time I've been referred to as a social media personality, which I guess I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but I am yapping online constantly.
I think it's good to share these insights that you have or these interests that you have with an audience in a way that it is easier for them to connect with it. I don't know that you set out to become a social media personality, but if that is a byproduct of the work that you're doing, hey, so be it.
I'll take that. Yeah, in this day and age, I think you have to be there to some degree.
So the work that you do is something we should probably ground listeners in. So why don't we start off by talking about the specific premise behind your book, which, as I mentioned, is called Uncharted Territory. What is that all about?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background. I've always been involved with music and I've always liked playing in bands, but in college I studied math and economics, and out of college I was working in economic consulting, which resulted in me spending most of my days in spreadsheets. And I was looking just for a musical outlet at the time I was working that job, and I came up with this idea that I was going to listen to every number one hit song on the Billboard Hot 100 in history. Billboard Hot 100 is Billboard magazine's pop music chart. It was launched in August 1958. So I'd come home from work every day. I'd look up what the number one song was. I'd listen to it. I'd probably try to play along on my guitar. It was a nice way to ground myself and relax at the end of the day. But like I said, during the day I was working in spreadsheets, so I started tracking facts and figures about these songs in the spreadsheet, and it started out small. It was like, a friend and I who was listening with me, we'd rate the songs out of 10 and I'd track our ratings. Slowly over time, I started to include so much other stuff about each of these number one hits, everything from who wrote the songs, what label put it out, how long is it, to what was the lyrical topic of the song, what key was it in, what was the time signature, who were the producers, what was the gender of the producers and the songwriters, where was the artist from. Actually, this data set's online, and I hope people find it useful. But then as I built that data set, which was just for fun, I guess, I started noticing some trends, and I just felt compelled to write about them. And then slowly over time, I'd written enough where a book emerged. A lot of this process was just slowly over time. Things happened. There wasn't a grand scheme at the beginning, but that's how the book came together and how it started.
Now, when you started, then it was a one hit per day or a couple hits per day and not necessarily chronological order. Is that right?
So initially, I came across a playlist on Spotify that had all the number one hits on it. And I was just searching around and I would come upon some interesting things. And then I was like, oh, okay, I want to try to listen to all these chronologically. So I would after that point, I would do one song per day. And there's about 1,200-ish. Mm-hmm. You could do the math. If you do one a day, it'll take a couple years.
Yeah, it sounds like 60 years plus of number one hits does sound daunting at best to me. Is there any time at which you had embarked on this and you thought, oh no, I've turned to this thing I love into a years-long burden?
When my life got busy, yes, I would sometimes think that I'd be like, I gotta go home and listen to a number one hit. Also, there are a couple rough stretches of number one hits that will make you question your journey. But in general, it was really one song a day. So I would just take it a day at a time. It wasn't much of a chore. I would get to listen to a song. Sometimes I knew it, sometimes I didn't. So as a musician, it was something that I really came to like.
And I like that you built this data set. You didn't just go out and say, oh, I'm going to see what I can grab, because building the data set sometimes leads to smart choices about what you're trying to include. And you can be confident in the level of specificity you have in the data, what it means, how you collected it. And I think that lends itself to the kind of analysis that you can feel good about doing and tends to be more distinctive than what you might find out there.
Totally. In my newsletter, I frequently have a question, and when I go to try to find data to answer it, it doesn't exist in the form that I want. I end up having to build the data set, which is always a pain when I start the process, but I think it actually leads to better answers because you have to become so familiar with the data when you're trying to build it and really get in the weeds. And I don't think there is a way to actually do quality data analysis without getting in the weeds and doing some really tedious data cleaning. As some people I know say, data analysis is 90% data cleaning. And if you're going to try to get out of the data cleaning, then you probably won't be as familiar with the data set as you should be.
Absolutely true. Now, you mentioned as you were going through this project that there were definite rough patches along the way, and you do structure your book time period by time period. It's not just the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. You went through a sort of shorter time period that puts different musical trends into sharper relief than just going decade by decade.
Yeah, I chose to do that because, as I mentioned in the book, it's not like on December 31st, 1969, every musical trend of the 1960s ends. And on January 1st, 1970, all the new stuff starts. It's a nice way to think about music because, in general, trends sort of move in that way. But yeah, I wanted to focus things thematically, and really just I would listen to a point where I felt like I had something to say, and I would stop and write for a couple weeks about it.
I'm curious to know, were there any patterns or cycles that you noticed as you look through these sort of mini eras of music?
The biggest theme that I noticed that I think is one of the main through lines of the book is that musical evolution is often downstream of technological innovation, which that's a lot of syllables for only a couple words. But it was something that I saw as like anytime I would notice a trend, it would often tie back to something that had changed technologically. One of the examples I talk about in the book is the length of songs. Mm-hmm. And in the 50s and 60s, pop songs, what I'm tracking, are around 2.5 to 3 minutes. Then towards the end of the 60s, they start to grow in length. By 1980, they're like sitting at 4 minutes, and they sit there for a decades, and then in the 2010s, they start to get shorter again. And you're like, that's weird. On the surface, this could just seem like some trend that artists decided, and then it was a fad. These are fads artists are following. But in reality, which is that at the beginning of that time frame, singles were sold on little vinyl 45s. Those 45s could only hold so much sound before they would degrade. So artists were constrained by the amount of sound that could fit on that. By the end of the 60s, some technology improves and you start to get longer singles like Hey Jude by the Beatles or Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan. Some more stuff changes. I'm brushing over some of this. Some more stuff changes in the 70s. We get some bigger single sizes as disco becomes popular. And it sort of sits there. I mean, we sort of reach a point where, okay, it's not like it's just going to keep getting longer and longer as the technology improves. But then in the 2010s, when streaming arises, there are some financial incentives around the streaming model that make it such that shorter songs may pay you better. And we see artists react to that. So there's just changing technology, and artists are always, it's not deterministic, but artists are influenced by how technology changes. And that's one specific example, but it's something, again, I would see repeatedly as I was looking at trends.
And that's interesting because this is something that I think is hidden. Like, this is part of the invisible machinery behind music. Is as a listener, as maybe a naive listener, you're thinking, oh, the success or failure of a song is more dependent on its quality, its musicianship, like how it is connecting to the vibe of the current era, rather than, oh no, songs are getting longer because the technology is allowing them to be longer, or they're getting shorter because you're paid by the stream rather than by the length of time people are listening to you, or whatever the incentive is.
Yeah.
And are there other hidden systems that you found that were surprising to you as you went through this process?
Yeah, the ways that people are listening are certainly important. Again, I talk in the early 60s about the prevalence of fade outs in songs, and fade outs are not that common these days. And again, part of the reason the fade out comes back to two things. Again, the amount of music you can fit on a single, where a good example is House of the Rising Sun by the Animals. If you listen on the album, it's a much longer song because the single could only hold so much sound. They had to fade it out early. At the same time, radio was very important for breaking a hit song, and radio was very keen on songs being of a certain length because they wanted to sell a certain amount of commercials. So artists have to fit into these pre-existing conditions because what I'm talking about, I'm partially talking about music, but I'm really talking about the music business.
Mm-hmm.
And this, at the top of the charts, we are talking about people trying to sell as many copies of a song as possible. And if you want to sell as many copies of a song as possible, you have to play these games and be aware of how people are listening. That doesn't mean there is no artistic merit. The Beatles are arguably the most talented musical act of the 20th century. They sold a gazillion records. But you don't necessarily need quality to make it to number one.
You did mention the fade out starts to be less popular. I'm always curious to know about whether the fade in or the length of the instrumental intro makes a difference, because as someone of an age to have listened to the radio a lot, and that was where I got my music, there was often the talk up, the DJ trying to talk up the record and hit the post. And when the lyrics come in so early, there's no time for the talk up. And I'm curious, this is not a tasking I'm setting, but this is the sort of thing that I'm curious about.
Yeah.
Is are there longer instrumental intros in older songs because they were meant for radio versus now where not necessarily?
So I actually worked on a piece with The Economist a couple of years ago where we looked at the length of intros. Mm-hmm. It was based on this data set. And we did find that song intros have gotten dramatically shorter, not just in absolute terms, because songs have also gotten shorter, but in percentage terms. Like the percent of a song that is the introduction is shorter. And I think what you're describing, we actually didn't write about that specifically in this piece, but I think what you're describing hits the nail on the head, is that when radio was more important and you knew DJs were going to be talking over this, I'm sure that was something, at least implicitly, that artists were partially thinking about when they were making their records. I don't have a great quote. It's like some Madonna was like, I made this intro just so Casey Kasem could talk over it.
Right.
But I think that's a great theory, and it's something that sounds like something I would write about.
I also like the idea of the radio edit in the past being like, oh no, we need to make this shorter. And now the radio edit we need to change some of this language because the album cut's a little different.
Yeah, definitely. The radio is interesting. It still matters in certain quarters, especially in the country music world. Mm-hmm. Radio still makes hits in country, but it doesn't seem to matter as much for other genres.
Since you bring up that country and that genre, this is part of categorizing data. And in music, we are often categorizing it into genre of music. And one of the things that you do talk about is how do you categorize it, and why is this categorized as a country song versus something else when it's just that the artist maybe is from Nashville. And I worked in country music a little bit way back in my early career. And so I know there was a definite pro-Nashville or anti-not Nashville bias in the success or failure of music, at least in the late 90s.
It's genres, I think, to make this a point that's a little bit larger about categorizing data, it is really hard to categorize certain things just based on a piece of metadata. In the book, I talk about how we think of genre, I think, in the abstract about being about what a song sounds like, and to some degree it is, but genre is also wrapped up in race and gender and what artists look like. And the classic example I use is that the term R&B, it was created by Billboard magazine to replace their chart that was called the Race Records chart, which was literally just the chart of black artists. And then Jerry Wexler, who I think he ended up working at Atlantic Records, very famous in the music world. He was working at Billboard at the time, and they decided Race Records wasn't a good term anymore, and they came up with Rhythm and Blues, which was shortened to R&B. And that term still sticks around, and I think there is a legitimacy to the sound of music that we call R&B, or there are sonic qualities to it. But at the same time, it's very clear if you listen to R&B radio or if you listen to classic rock radio that we're doing some categorization based on what artists look like or where they're from or what gender a band is made up of. So I think in terms of categorizing things with data, it's important to be aware that things might not be as simple as they come across on the surface. We want to be consistent, but we want to be aware of these biases and what can come about because of them.
I think that's an interesting example, which could apply broadly, of course, to essentially any data set that we're working with. Any of the analysis that we're doing is it's easier for us to categorize things into our known boxes and then work from there because it makes everything cleaner. But as you pointed out, it's not just about cleaning as quickly as possible. It's about cleaning as accurately as possible. And it is going to take you a long time to disambiguate what is it that these specific things are and how can we get to the most accurate answer.
I think another good example is like I do talk about race throughout this book, race and gender. You can't really talk about the history of popular music without talking about those things. But tracking that is difficult and problematic in many ways. And what I ended up doing for race was I just went off what the census, the US Census said, because I was like, okay, at least that is like a methodology that somebody who has thought about this more than me has decided to use. But you sort of end up creating binary categories in a way that you miss out on certain things. In my data set, I'm broadly looking at, are artists white or are they black? There are many other ways you can talk about ethnicity or your cultural background that I'm certainly going to miss out on because of that. And I try to be, I think as long as we're upfront about the ways that the things that our data is not going to be able to show us, then we can talk about them and we can use these categories even though they simplify things. But I think it's important to be aware of that and to tell people when you're writing about it, about the limitations that you're working with.
And being clear about your approach, your methodology, and about what you're trying to say is critical. And it's something I think that you do address very clearly in your writing. And your writing, just generally speaking, is, in my opinion, very approachable, which is something that is challenging for many people who work with data on a regular basis, who maybe self-identify more as data analysts than as communicators. And I was curious if you could share some of the approach that you take in order to make these sort of data-heavy, maybe caveat-required insights readable or engaging or human.
Yeah. Always put the most technical matter in a footnote, because then if someone wants the information, it'll be there. But I think when you put it in the body of a text, it sometimes makes it less approachable. I try to write things as if I would speak them. And usually when I finish writing something, I literally speak it out loud. And if something sounds awkward, I will change it. You don't want to dumb things down too much where they're inaccurate. I do think the one thing that I am lucky with is that I'm ultimately talking about music. Even if I'm talking about something a little bit technical, at the end of the paragraph, I'm probably going to mention a song that you're familiar with, or if it's in my newsletter, link out to something that you can listen to. I think that makes me very lucky in the sense that no matter how fancy the statistics or the data analysis is, there are these cultural objects that can really ground people. But I think being able to use examples that people are familiar with when you're talking about something technical can make them more approachable to your general audience. And I'm writing for a general audience. I don't want you to feel like you're reading a calculus textbook when you're reading what I'm writing. But yeah, I definitely try to write like I'm talking to you, which I think can make things more approachable. That's my general philosophy.
It is true, I think, that music as a topic is something that people do grab onto, although everybody has their own experience of music. We're all different ages, we have different preferences, but there are, especially when you go back further in time, there are those cultural touchstone artists and songs that people say, oh, if I start from understanding this, like this is part of the discussion that Chris is having here, then I can get that connection there. And finding something that people can hold on to, whether it's a metaphor or something that they can connect to their own life, helps them to start to make sense of something that maybe is technical. They might even dig into the footnote if they're curious about the specifics of something.
Cultural objects are great for that, whether it's music, movies, or television, but sports also works for a lot of people. I mean, that might alienate some readers. Politics, I mean, anything that's an example that people are going to be generally familiar with. And again, part of the reason that I'm lucky with songs is that if I'm talking about a specific song and you're not familiar with it, realistically, the song's probably 3 or 4 minutes. You can click play. If you don't know what it is, I'm not asking you to sit down and watch a 4-hour movie. So I'm lucky in a certain sense.
Yeah, and the stories that you tell, not just in the book, but in your newsletter, which I've been following for a while, also I really appreciate. I recommend to people who are interested in
Thank you.
music and analytics. How do you approach a story differently when the topic or the story is the assumption we had turns out it was correct versus, hey, something that we thought was correct ends up being wildly inaccurate?
I do this in the book. I definitely do it in the newsletter. I think that there's like a bias in the academic world where we really just want to publish new results or groundbreaking results, whereas it's boring when you're like, here's what everyone thought, and hey, it turns out that's true. Something I do in the newsletter is if I have a question and I think the question's interesting, if the result goes against the general notion of what's correct or agrees with it, I'm going to publish the newsletter no matter what. Because I think it's important for people to realize that sometimes you don't discover something truly groundbreaking. So I generally try to approach it the same from both sides, as I describe the topic and ground it in the same way, whether the result ends up being something novel or something that you're already familiar with. I guess my point here is don't shy away from publishing things that just agree with what everyone already thinks about a topic. That's okay. That's a legitimate contribution to the thinking on the subject. And even when you generally agree with something, sometimes you also might discover like a nuance that's a little bit different. And I think when you're writing a newsletter or you're trying to tell a story, it's important to make people aware that all of our intuitions aren't incorrect.
Are there any misconceptions that you are personally tired of hearing of because the data keeps proving them incorrect?
I think the topic I talk about most that people are misinformed on is how music streaming payouts work. I work for a music streaming service, so sure, I have my own biases that pays my salary. There's this idea that streaming services don't pay out any money or the payouts are too small, and there are legitimate criticisms to how the model actually works. And I work on processing these royalty statements, and often I'm wondering, why does it work like this? But I think this is a place where actually getting into the details is important if we want to improve the system. Something book related that I talk about frequently is the idea of artists writing their own songs. I definitely came in with this notion that artists did not write their own songs. They were professional songwriters, they were performers, and that was a separate duty. Carole King and Jerry Goffin write the song, and then Bobby V performs it or what have you. And then the Beatles show up in the early 60s. They're a creative unit. They're going to write the music. They're going to perform the music. And then suddenly after that, if you want it to be taken seriously, you had to write your own songs. There is certainly truth to that narrative, and I demonstrate that in chapter 3 of the book. But what you also see if you look further back in the data is that artists were more regularly writing their own songs for about a decade before the Beatles show up. And when you look at who the Beatles were influenced by, whether that be Chuck Berry or Little Richard or Buddy Holly, those were guys that were also writing their own music. It's nice. It's a nice story to act where the Beatles showed up and everything changed. But I think it's also important to put the Beatles in context, to be like, they were part of this much larger musical world. And like everyone else, they were influenced by things and they were part of trends. I like to talk about the Beatles as just, they are a revolutionary band, but also just talk about them sometimes as if they are just another 1960s band. And they were dealing with the same technologies and trends that many of the other artists at the time were.
That was it, that quote where it's like, oh, we're just a band that happened to get big, but they were only around in the US, only around for 8 years or so.
Oh yeah, it's insane. That's from, I think, the first Beatles anthology, just a little quote from John Lennon where he was like, we're just a band that made it very big, which is the understatement of all time. But also it's important to think like that. I'm a huge Beatles fan, and I think there's so many things that continue to shock me about them. One of the biggest being what you just said. The biggest band of all time is only around for 7 or 8 years in the US. It's mind-boggling how much they got done, how quickly. You don't want to mythologize too much. And I try to do that in the book, but it's hard.
And sometimes that stardom aspect takes on a life of its own. We had a Taylor Swift bout of stardom over the last year specifically, where I can't imagine an artist ever being this huge, but people have been this huge, or artists have been that huge at different times. It's just maybe the memory of how huge it was fades, or it could happen again. I know you have a whole piece in the book about it is possible for new stars to be created, even if it feels like, oh, there's no way that music's too diverse now. It's very difficult to do, but in fact, the data says you can do it.
Yeah, definitely. We are still minting new stars. There is certainly truth to what people talk about where culture has become more fragmented. It's not like everyone's sitting down every night watching Johnny Carson and whoever Carson happens to have on is the next star. The way I've learned this promoting this book is I was lucky enough to go on CNN to do a very short segment, talk for 2 minutes about the book. I got a ton of text messages and phone calls about that, and it certainly creates more legitimacy for the Chris Dalla Riva enterprise. But that appearance did not sell as many copies as like a viral Instagram post. The world is just more fractured, and the way we find out about things is very different. So stardom feels different, but we certainly mint new stars.
You know what's interesting? Like now we're getting into the business of not just music, of books, is you talk about like the auteur theory. We assume people have to write their own songs, or for instance, that you have to write your own book, but then you look at your own acknowledgments and there's how many people listed in there and how many people contribute to the writing or the production of any one song or any one book or anything. And then all of the other things that you are required to do in order to publicize a thing. It's like it's not just, oh, I just hand it off to my marketing team and my job is done. Everybody is involved in other aspects. When you were talking about the writing of music these days, oh, now there's somebody who writes the beats, and there's somebody who does the top line stuff, and then you also get involved in the production of your song nowadays, and you didn't used to do that. The table stakes of music change and of business change over the course of time, and we all just have to roll with it.
Yeah, I think the reason we think like that is that it's easier. It's easier to be like, oh, Paul McCartney and John Lennon did it all by themselves. Taylor Swift does it all by herself. But it's not the case. And there is, to be a star like that, no matter how talented you are, there's so much luck involved. I even think about me publishing this book. I had been beating the drum about it for years trying to find a publisher. And the only reason I ended up finding someone was I posted a TikTok about a #1 hit called Want Ads by Honeycomb, which I continue to tell people is tremendously underrated. And a writer named Fred Bronson, who's in the acknowledgments, he saw the TikTok, we ended up talking, and then he ended up connecting me with someone. So there's just, for me, I'm like, in my head, I'm like, oh, there was so much luck involved for me just getting this book published. Like, to become Taylor Swift, there has to be tremendous amounts of luck and meeting the right people and finding the right collaborators. Even if you are immensely talented, there are a lot of really talented people out there, but that's an important, I don't think I talk enough about that in the book, but that's an important part to how this stuff works is you got lucky.
Yeah, to be the very top of the pyramid, everything has to go right and you have to be talented.
Yes.
But you don't have to be the absolute tip of the pyramid to be successful. Like there are upper levels to it. Like it just, the more you get away from the base, the more and more successful you are, in a sense.
Yeah, definitely. There are so many degrees of success. I do a monthly mailbag in my newsletter where people ask me questions, and they listed a group of contemporary jazz musicians. It's like, how do these people make money? So they're not making Taylor Swift money, but first of all, they're probably making most of their money playing live. And I went and looked up the one guy, this guy, John Pizzarelli, and he was playing like a 2-week residency in New York City, and tickets were $200. I'm like, he's probably pulling in some pretty good cash doing that. So there are lots of different ways to make money in the music business. I'm sure it's nice if you're making Taylor Swift money, but you can have a career and not be selling out stadiums.
I think people who are listening are often interested in the way that we visualize data as well as the way we talk about data. And you did choose to have visuals that go along with your writing in Uncharted Territory. And it was a collaborator of yours, Kaylee Nerney, was your illustrator. And I was curious to know how you landed on the visual style that you were using in the book. They're really simple, relatively simple, but they're also playful. And I was curious to know how you landed on that as the vibe you wanted to go along with your writing.
Kaylee is my friend. I went to college with her now husband, and she's a great graphic designer. And in my newsletter, I have graphics, but it's really simple stuff. I usually make it through Data Wrapper, which is a free tool. Back in the day, I would just make stuff through Excel. And honestly, for the most part, that gets the point across, especially when I'm churning out newsletters every week. But I knew if I was going to put something down in print that I wanted it to have its own distinctive style. And I wanted these charts to be fun to look at, even though they're in black and white. I thought at first we were going to be able to do color, but that's more expensive. So we had to get creative to work within that constraint. And basically what I would do with her was I aggregated all the data. I usually within the data, like the Excel workbook I sent her, I'd mock up a line chart or something just to be like, all right, I think we should do this as a line chart, or I think we should do this as a bar chart. And then I would let her run with it. And I had her make 2 or 3 to start, probably the first 2 or 3 graphics in the book. And we decided on a style, we agreed on a style, and then she went and churned through all of them. And our general philosophy was, I want this to be accurate, but I also want it to be playful because, again, we're talking about popular songs. This is not like medical research or something. So I want it to feel as approachable as turning on the radio and hearing your favorite song, but I don't want it to be deceptive. I feel like when you make graphics really playful, it's really easy to be like, oh, we'll distort the axis a little, or we'll move these labels around a little. So my baseline was like, all right, this has to be accurate, and then we'll weave in the playfulness from there. But it was great. It was great working with her. I could have never done that by myself, and she's a professional. So I definitely recommend working with people who can do that stuff when you get the opportunity. But at the same time, if you're just putting an article online, I don't think you should feel any shame if you're just pasting an Excel line chart. That often gets the point across.
Oh yeah, simple and clear are key, especially when they're trying to get people to understand something that's best perceived visually. Before we wrap up today, I do want to touch on the topic of authenticity, which is a theme that runs through the newsletter and the book. And you talk about your own experience with Gen AI tools, Suno specifically, and you compare that to the firestorm that alleged fakers Milli Vanilli faced back in 1990. So after all the research you've done, all the stuff that you continue to do, can you talk a little bit about what to you makes something authentically real?
Oh, man.
Big question.
This is a tough question. As I was growing up, I had certain perceptions about musical realness or authenticity, and it was often connected to, I was really into classic rock. So it was like, to be authentic, you have to be performing your own instruments and writing your own songs. And as I discovered writing this book, that idea was really something that was invented in the 1960s. Like Frank Sinatra he's always my counterexample. No one's listening to a Sinatra record and being like, oh, this isn't authentic because he didn't write the music, or he wasn't playing the violin on the strings that are in the background of the songs. So I think authenticity is just about, are you properly conveying the thing that you set out to convey? If you're doing that, then you are being authentic. There's a million different ways to be authentic. At the same time, there are many things that push this definition to its limits. In the late 80s, Milli Vanilli was a good example. Milli Vanilli was a European duo who became very popular at the end of the 80s. They ended up winning Best New Artist at the Grammys. And then it came out that the 2 guys that were in all the music videos on the cover of the records, Fab and Rob, I think their names were, they were lip syncing everything in concert. Not only that, but they didn't even appear on the record at all. There were 2 other guys that were doing all the singing. It was just Fab and Rob had the look. This came out, it was a huge scandal. It's the only time a Grammy's ever been rescinded. People flipped out about this. I think they got a raw deal. One guy ended up developing a drug addiction. It's a sad story. That, for a lot of people, that's not authentic. But over the years, we've seen more and more things come about that make me question, was it really that inauthentic? For example, we manipulate our voices in so many different ways. When Cher is singing her hit Believe and they're using auto-tune technology to give her voice an alien-like sound, is that inauthentic because it's being manipulated? And the thing ultimately is that recording itself is about manipulation. The fact that you can record a second take, you are manipulating reality. You could punch in and fix a mistake. So it just raises a lot of questions about what does it mean to be real and authentic? And I think people get upset about this when in reality, if you are dealing with, again, the music business, where the goal is just to sell a gazillion copies of a record, authenticity isn't the chief concern of most people working, trying to sell 1 million records. And anytime you come up with a definition of authenticity, there's probably something you consider authentic that is going to push up against or contradict whatever standards you have. So do I think Milli Vanilli was authentic? No, but I think it's a grayer area than we consider, which brings us to the AI of it all. Recently, there have been these, as with every other industry, there's been generative AI companies that have cropped up in the music industry, most prominent of which is a company called Suno, where you go and you type in a text prompt and it spits back a song. And there have been some things that were created with this have gone viral. And the question looms, is this authentic? I'm sure in a certain way, it could be conceived as authentic, and you can have legitimate artists who get some output and then manipulate it a ton. I think the ultimate problem, or the largest problem with it, is that it is first presented as a way of democratizing music, which I've always just found is very silly. You can sing right now. Anyone can make music. Music was democratized when they created like the at-home piano and the acoustic guitar. Over the last 20 years, recording technology and distribution costs have become so cheap. We were already seeing hundreds of thousands of uploads of music to the internet per day. The idea that music was not democratized, I think, is silly. So I think that's just like a false claim. And at the same time, there is this idea that the way this technology works is that it's been trained on every piece of recorded music in history. And if you're not going to allow people to opt out of their music being used in that, and you're not going to compensate them for that, then I think, again, it really cuts against your claims that this is like a legitimate, authentic way to make music. There's so much grayness in this topic where part of me at the end of the day is, does authenticity matter, or does it just matter if something is good or bad? I'm not sure. I thought through this a little bit more, but I don't know completely.
Well, on a spectrum from petrified to exhilarated, where would you find yourself as a musician about the prospect of these tools being available that purports to make it easier for you to execute your vision of what you want to be able to create?
Closer to petrified, okay. But I'm sure there will be some legitimate use cases for the technology. That's something I see throughout writing the book, is repeatedly there's new technology, people flip out and they're like, okay, there are some legitimate use cases here. I mostly worry about, this is different because can artists be compensated for this? And does it just further entrench the stars of today?
Right.
If the next generation of artists is going to use these tools and they are all just trained on the music of the 20th century, does that just lead to bigger payouts for the stars of yesteryear and make it harder for the next crop of people to rise up? And those are things that I legitimately worry about.
On the authenticity side, one of the biggest songs of this past summer was Golden by Huntrix, an animated band from K-pop Demon Hunters, which nobody is pretending that cartoons are singing. Obviously, there are real people behind this, but we don't see it as inauthentic. We just see it as, this is a great song. Like, you can actually see video of the people who recorded it as well, but I couldn't tell you their names. I know the band is Huntrix. And as we wrap up, this is something that appeals to me as a music trivia enthusiast and writer and host. And when you find things like, oh, there hasn't been an animated band with a #1 hit since the Archies. Let's say this is stuff that you are really good at unearthing in your research, both in the book and in the 101 Things You Learned while writing the book, which came up in your newsletter. My last question for you is, if you were writing a sort of Final Jeopardy style question based on something in your book or something that you might have discovered, what's the direction you would go in? What sort of question would you write?
My favorite thing is, people are always, their jaw drops the most, is when you talk about artists that did not ever have a #1 hit. So I like this idea around artists who wrote a #1 hit, but only ever got to #2 themselves. And there are a handful of examples, but there are some prominent ones, like Bruce Springsteen wrote the song Blinded by the Light, which a group called Manfred Mann's Earth Band took to #1. But the best he ever did was get to #2 with Dancing in the Dark. Dancing in the Dark got stuck behind Prince's When Doves Cry. So I would go in, I don't know exactly how I would phrase it, but I would go in this direction because there are like multiple layers. It's like you could ask people, what was the #1 they wrote? What was their highest charting song? What did it get stuck behind? Or I could present that Bruce Springsteen case there, and I could say, this also happened to Bob Dylan. What was the #1 song he wrote, and what was the best he ever did as a solo artist? So I think that combines like multiple levels of things that I find interesting, and from talking to people, things that they are interested in too.
Just so you know, I, of course, then did go out and listen to Want Ads by Honeycomb. Your work is successfully spreading the love of this.
The gospel of honeycomb.
The gospel of honeycomb.
Funny enough, I was watching TV the other day, and there was an American Express commercial, and I swear to God, I heard Want Ads by Honeycomb in the background, and I was like, I'm tempted to try to find. I was trying to find the commercial after. I can't find it, but I'm tempted to find out who made it, because I talk about how this song. It's a great song, and this is no cultural footprint, and I'm on a quest to make people aware of it. But it is. I think I heard it in the background of a commercial, so I'm like, maybe word's getting out.
Chris, thanks for spending time with us today. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, if you search Chris Dalla Riva online, I am on most social media platforms. I'm most active on Instagram and TikTok, where my handle's C Dalla Riva Music. My newsletter is called Can't Get Much Higher. That comes out 1 or 2 times a week. And go check out my book, Uncharted Territory, What Numbers Tell Us About the Biggest Hit Songs and Ourselves. Right now, I know it's stocked on Amazon. They're restocking at some other outlets, but theoretically, you should be able to get it anywhere online.
Thank you so much for sharing your process, your passion with us today. Best of luck with the book. And everyone, as mentioned earlier, give Chris some recurring revenue. Sign up for the paid tier of Can't Get Much Higher. That's my suggestion to you. I wish you, Chris, and everyone listening continued success telling stories with your data.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This was a ton of fun.